Hello, everybody. It's time to dig into more of John Paul Miller's affidavit that he filed in Mica Francis's probate case. We're starting on Statement 15 with John Paul telling us that Mica sent a text to her brother Nate telling him how supportive John Paul had been and how her sisters had been lying to the mental health nurses. That's not what Mica wrote, though. She did say that John Paul had been supportive, but she also said this, quote, "We are going to Waccamaw on Monday, hopefully with redacted, and we are going to confront redacted about everything that's happened over the past year and how she's been lying all along. Waccamaw Mental Health, redacted, is the head horse, but I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be nurse, that said redacted and Sierra have been blowing up their phones harassing them, that they were the ones telling the cops that John Paul was starving and beating me. Well, all along, Redacted and Sierra said they never said any of those things." So Mica wasn't saying that her sisters had been lying to the nurse, but the other way around. The nurse was the one who had been lying. Wouldn't it be interesting to know who this nurse is? John Paul didn't date this statement, other than February 2024, but it's in between the statements that are dated January 30th and February 5th. Does Mica wanting to confront the nurse have anything to do with her being involuntarily committed? Also, notice that Mica's texts are on the right of the screen, which means these screenshots were taken from her phone, the phone that John Paul took while she was in the hospital. In Statement 16, John Paul wrote that Mica texted her father and brother on February 5th to tell them that John Paul takes care of her on a day-to-day basis. But those texts are also telling them that she trusts them to look after her well-being, and she's hoping they'll all communicate in this group text so everyone is on the same page. Nate calmly replied that he hopes John Paul will be open to these discussions and won't be offended. John Paul's response was to go on a rant about how her family wants to keep her medication from her and that he's blocked Michael because he's a moron. Well, sorry, Nate. Looks like John Paul did not handle it well. Statement 17 is dated February 6th of 2024. John Paul texted Nate to tell him that Mica's doctor was going to admit her to the hospital and claims she's suffering from a bipolar episode. Nate lets Mica know that John Paul is trying to have her committed. John Paul tells Nate he's a moron. Well, John Paul sure loves that word moron, doesn't he? I wonder if he learned that in divinity school. Oh, never mind. He never went. In Statement 18, John Paul texts Mica's family later that day and said, quote, "Just so everyone knows, her doctor said it can get incredibly worse." Her sister Abby asked, "What will get worse? She was fine when I saw her yesterday, and she said she'd been taking her meds." John Paul responded that Mica was having a bipolar and schizophrenic breakdown. When did schizophrenia get thrown into this, by the way? I guess maybe using bipolar wasn't sensational enough for Pee-wee. John Paul also states that Mica's father encouraged her to leave the county, but he left out the part of the text where Michael wrote, "Since John Paul is not properly medicating himself." Well, why'd you leave out that part, Jonnifer? Michael also let Mica know that John Paul was in the text messages she was sending, and she responded with, "I know, it's intentional." You know what? That sounds like an entirely sane woman to me. In Statement 19, John Paul claims that Mica called him and said her father told her she didn't need her medication. If we look at the screenshot he provided as evidence, which is the same screenshot from Statement 17, there's a screenshot in the screenshot. It's not easy to read, but in it, John Paul had texted Nate that, quote, "Mica's doctor called several times today. After they spoke with her, they called me back and told me if I don't call the police to take her to the hospital, they will. I refused, so they told me they are filling out paperwork with a judge in Conway, etc., and that sometime in the next 4 days the police will be picking her up." End quote. Nate sent this to the family group text so Mica could see what was going on. And John Paul responded to that with, quote, "Let the record show that Nate is the one who told a psychotic patient who's having a mental breakdown that police are coming to get her. So whatever happens from that info is not on Mica's husband, but 100% on Nate." End quote. Then Mica responded with, "Everyone stay calm. Police are not coming to my house, and if they do, I'm not a threat to anyone's life, so they cannot take me in my home or the church's home." So once again, she sounds entirely sane. Also, I'm going to say that I think John Paul was the one who instigated the involuntary commitment. He might not have signed the papers, but I don't think he refused to call the police or any other similar nonsense. Statement 20 is dated February 6th of 2024, and John Paul states that Waccamaw Center for Mental Health filled out the emergency hospitalization paper, saying Mica was homicidal, suicidal, hallucinating, delusional, and much more. But nobody in her family cared at all what the doctors or police officer thought. Now, no one knows what police officer he's talking about. He probably doesn't even know. So let's look at this janky paperwork from Waccamaw Center for Mental Health. There are 2 notary seals on it. One is faint, but it looks like the expiration date on it is 2021 rather than 2025 or possibly 26 that is on the other seal. Katrina Presley, who notarized the statement, is the director at Waccamaw Center for Mental Health at the South Strand Clinic. Faith Green is the affiant and states that she is diagnosed with bipolar disorder, has stopped taking medications, having hallucinations, delusions, impulsive behaviors, verbal aggression, psychosis, threats towards others, and self. According to South Carolina state law, the person who is signing as an affiant on an involuntary commitment has to have seen the behavior firsthand. So I'm wondering when Faith saw this behavior for Mica and where it was documented besides on this sketchy-looking paperwork. But there's nothing to see here, folks. Absolutely nothing. Everything is just tickety-boo. Let's all look at the next shiny thing John Paul is waving around. Statement 21 is also dated February 6th, and John Paul claims that Sierra texted Mica with information on how to avoid being obtained by the police for the hospital. That's not exactly what Sierra wrote, though. She simply told Mica how the 72-hour mental health hold worked. In Statement 22, John Paul states that Michael sent Mica the information about the doctor and that Michael did it to put a wedge between John Paul and Mica. Or maybe he was just wanting Mica to know what was going on with her own life. Statement 23 is dated February 6th and has a timestamp of 6:46 p.m. And John Paul states that the police continue to look for Mica as she runs from them. Why is he trying to act like she was a fugitive from the law and they were tracking her down with bloodhounds? John Paul attached a police report, and it states that John Paul had called them and, quote, "The caller states that his wife is showing on the phone at this location," end quote. And the police report also indicates that Mica isn't dangerous and doesn't have a history of being dangerous. So John Paul was tracking Mica through her phone, and he just admitted it on an affidavit. He says he refused to call the police when the hospital called him, but now, all of a sudden, he's helping them track her down. Statement 24 is dated February 7th, and John Paul says that the police are still looking for Mica. He attached the police report when Mica called the police about people staying at her house and about the laptop that had photos of her on it. We've now heard that 911 call, and Mica sounds perfectly lucid and entirely in her right mind. In the next episode, we'll look at Mica's stay at Waccamaw Center for Mental Health. Thanks for watching. I'll be back soon.